I never thought a single sentence could hit me that hard, but the night he stood in my kitchen and said he no longer felt inspired by who I'd become, something in me just snapped. I didn't yell, didn't ask him to stay. I just stood there, holding a half-cold cup of coffee, feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. It was the kind of moment where your brain tries to protect you by going numb, but your chest still feels every inch of the blow. And the worst part, a tiny voice inside me whispered, maybe he's right. I kept replaying his words long after he walked out the door. Why did that one sentence tear through me the way it did? I'd love to say it was shock or heartbreak or something poetic, but honestly, it was because he said out loud the thing I'd been terrified to admit. I wasn't just losing him. I'd been losing myself for a long time. I'd been hiding in oversized hoodies, avoiding mirrors, brushing off friends when they asked if I was okay. I joked about being too tired to function like that was a personality trait, but really I was exhausted from pretending everything was fine. It wasn't just the weight or the stress or the late-night emotional eating I kept promising I'd stop tomorrow. It was the feeling that I'd shrunk inside my own life, like I was moving through my days on autopilot while the real me sat somewhere in the back, quietly slipping away. So when he said he didn't feel inspired by who I'd become, it wasn't just a breakup line. It was a mirror I hadn't been ready to look into. And as much as I hated how much it hurt, some part of me knew it wasn't about him leaving. It was about the version of myself I'd abandoned long before he did. Looking back, I didn't know it yet, but that moment was only the beginning. I used to joke that busy was my whole personality, but the truth was I hid behind that word because it sounded better than admitting I was running on junk food and denial. I'd grab drive-through twice a day and tell myself I deserved it after a long shift. I'd chug iced coffee like it was some kind of life support. And every night, instead of stepping outside for a short walk, I'd sink into the same spot on the couch, scrolling through other people's lives while pretending mine wasn't slowly collapsing. My body showed it first. The weight crept up, then rushed in. My clothes felt tighter, but I kept blaming the dryer. My face looked different, rounder, heavier, like it belonged to someone older than me. I avoided mirrors because even a quick glimpse felt like an accusation. But it wasn't just the physical stuff. I was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. The kind of tired that sits in your bones and makes everything feel like too much effort. I remember standing in the shower one morning, leaning against the wall, wondering how my life got so small without me noticing. I'd become the girl who watched other people live instead of living anything herself. And even though I laughed about it with friends, called myself a walking energy drink disaster, deep down I knew something was slipping, and I didn't know how to reach for it again. I didn't say any of this out loud back then. I thought if I didn't name it, it wasn't real. But looking back, that version of me was already calling for help in the only ways she knew how. I just hadn't learned to listen yet. And that's where things really started to shift. The worst part of that season wasn't the weight or the tiredness. It was how small my world became. I'd make excuses to skip birthdays, lunches, anything that required being around people who still seemed alive. I told my friends I was just overwhelmed. But the truth was I couldn't stand the thought of sitting in a room where everyone looked comfortable in their skin while I kept tugging at my clothes, trying to disappear. At work, I became an expert at timing my breaks so I wouldn't have to join conversations. Some days I'd hide in a bathroom stall, pretending to answer emails, because the idea of making eye contact felt like stepping into a spotlight I never asked for. I started believing every whisper was about me. Every laugh was someone noticing how much I'd changed. Home, things got even quieter. My relationship didn't fall apart overnight. It faded like a light bulb that flickers for months before going dark. We stopped planning things. We stopped touching. I stopped trying. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't think I was someone worth caring about. It's strange how quickly you can talk yourself out of being loved when you already feel like a burden. I kept waiting for him to ask what was wrong, but I also dreaded the idea of telling him and seeing pity in his eyes. So instead we just drifted. Two people living in the same space but miles apart, each of us pretending it wasn't happening. There were nights I'd sit on the edge of my bed and feel this heavy mix of shame and anger. Shame for letting myself fall apart, anger for not knowing how to stop it. I wanted someone to pull me out, to tell me I wasn't imagining things, but asking for help felt almost embarrassing, like admitting I'd lost control of my own life. So I kept going, playing the part of someone who had it mostly together, while slowly unraveling behind closed doors. And even then, I had no idea the real breaking point was still waiting for me. I sat in that parking lot longer than I want to admit, staring at the steering wheel like it had answers. My phone kept lighting up with messages from people who had no idea my whole life had just cracked open, and I didn't even have the energy to lie with one of those "I'm fine" texts. The strange thing was, after the first wave of heartbreak passed, there was this other feeling underneath it, something heavier, older. It wasn't about him leaving. It was the realization that I'd abandoned myself long before he walked out that door. And sitting there, with my face still burning from crying, I felt this mix of shame and clarity hit me all at once. When I finally drove home, the silence felt like a judgment I couldn't escape. Every corner of the apartment reminded me of how disconnected I'd become from my own life. I opened the fridge out of habit, ready to numb everything the only way I knew how, but for the first time it didn't work. I just stood there, holding the door open, realizing nothing in front of me could fix what was breaking inside. It scared me how empty I felt. Not dramatic, not falling apart, just hollow. Like I'd run out of versions of myself to pretend to be. I crawled into bed fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself imagine what would happen if nothing changed. Not in some motivational way, but in a brutally honest one. I saw the same days repeating, the same exhaustion, the same quiet resentment toward myself. And that image hurt more than the breakup ever could. Somewhere in that long, restless night, something in me whispered that I couldn't keep living like a ghost in my own life. I didn't make any promises to myself. I didn't swear I'd turn everything around. I just knew that if I kept going the way I was, I'd lose more than a relationship. I'd lose the tiny piece of myself I still recognized. And as much as I didn't want to face it, that realization was the thing that finally pushed me forward. But I had no idea what was coming next. The next morning, I didn't wake up with some dramatic sense of purpose. I just couldn't sit in that apartment another minute. My chest felt tight, my thoughts were all over the place, and walking seemed like the only thing I had enough energy to do. So I stepped outside without thinking too much, still wearing the same hoodie from the night before. The air was cooler than I expected, and for a moment it shocked me awake in a way coffee hadn't in months. I didn't walk fast. Honestly, it was barely more than a slow shuffle down my block. But my body reacted, almost like it had been waiting for me to move, to do something that didn't involve hiding from myself. Halfway down the street, I realized my breathing felt different. Not easier, but more grounded. Like my body was reminding me it still existed, still had needs I'd been ignoring. And there was this strange relief in acknowledging that. I'd spent so long trying not to feel anything that even the simple ache in my legs felt honest. For 5 minutes, I wasn't thinking about him, or the breakup, or the version of myself I was terrified I'd become. I was just a woman walking around her neighborhood, trying to find a little quiet in her own head. When I got back home, I didn't feel transformed or proud or any of those big words people like to use. I just felt a tiny shift, almost like a whisper that said, "You're not completely gone yet." And I didn't know what to do with that. Part of me wanted to ignore it, go back to the numbness I knew so well. But another part, the part one hadn't heard from in a long time, wanted to see where that whisper might lead if I didn't shut it down. I didn't realize it then, but that small, clumsy walk was about to change more than I ever expected. Looking back, it was only the beginning. Didn't hit me all at once. It was more like this slow, uncomfortable truth rising to the surface, the kind you try to push down but it keeps coming back, insisting on being felt. Over the next few days, I noticed how often I moved through my life on autopilot. I'd catch myself reaching for things out of habit, saying yes to stuff I didn't want, shrinking in conversations without even thinking about it. And every time I felt that familiar urge to hide, there was this new tug inside me, almost annoyed, almost desperate, saying, "You can't keep doing this." For the first time, instead of brushing it off, I let myself sit with it. I started admitting tiny truths I'd avoided for years, like how exhausted I was from pretending I didn't care, or how much I missed feeling connected to my own body. Not in a vanity way, but in a I don't want to disappear way. It was strange, realizing the person I wanted to fight for wasn't someone I had lost. It was someone I had ignored. And the idea of finally choosing myself felt both terrifying and a little freeing. I remember standing in my kitchen one evening, staring at my reflection in the microwave door. Classy, I know. And for the first time I didn't look away. I didn't love what I saw. I didn't even like it. But I saw someone who was still in there. Someone tired, someone hurt. But someone who wanted more than just surviving on the bare minimum. And that small, stubborn part of me whispered again, "You deserve better than this half-life." What surprised me most was realizing I wasn't trying to fix myself for anyone else. Not for him, not for friends, not to prove anything. This was about not losing the last pieces of myself to exhaustion and numbness. It wasn't motivation. It was preservation. And something about that made it feel real, like a decision I could actually follow through on, even in tiny ways. I didn't call it healing. I didn't call it a journey. Honestly, I didn't call it anything. I just knew I couldn't keep abandoning myself and expecting life to magically feel different. And that quiet realization, as small as it seemed, was the first time in a long time I felt awake. But looking back, I had no idea what was coming next. Those first few days felt almost awkward, like I was learning how to live in my own skin again. Switching my soda to water wasn't some triumphant lifestyle change. It was more like, okay, let's see if I can get through dinner without needing something sugary to take the edge off. And honestly, half the time I still missed the fizz. But I noticed that having a glass of water in my hand felt calmer somehow, like I was choosing something that didn't immediately work against me. It was a tiny, quiet win, and I held on to it. The 12-minute walks became this strange ritual I actually looked forward to. Not because they were easy, they weren't, but because it was the only part of my day where I didn't feel trapped inside my own head. I wasn't trying to hit a goal or be productive. I was just out there moving, even if it was slow. Some evenings I'd pass neighbors I'd never spoken to before, and they'd nod like they'd seen me 100 times. That small sense of being part of the world again. It mattered more than I expected. Turning off my phone early was the hardest. I'd gotten used to drowning myself in other people's posts until I couldn't feel my own life anymore. The first night I put it down early, my brain felt like a noisy apartment with all the lights turned on. But after a while, the noise softened, and there was a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. I wouldn't call it peace, but it was close enough to give me hope. And the sleep. God, I'd forgotten what real sleep felt like. Waking up without that heavy fog made the next day feel just that tiny bit more manageable. What surprised me most was how these tiny choices, things no one else would even notice, started to make me feel connected to myself again. Not proud, not fixed, just present. And once I felt that, even for a moment, I knew I didn't want to lose it. I didn't say it out loud then, but a part of me was starting to believe I could actually climb out of the mess I'd been living in. But I had no idea what was coming next. The morning I noticed those tiny changes, I didn't trust them at first. I stood in the bathroom brushing my teeth, and for a second I thought the mirror was just being kind because of the lighting. But then I caught myself taking a deeper breath without that familiar tightness, and it stopped me. It wasn't dramatic. No big revelation, no tears. Just this quiet surprise, like catching a glimpse of someone I hadn't seen in a long time. I pulled on an old t-shirt I used to avoid, half expecting it to look the same, and when it didn't cling the way it used to, I actually laughed. Not a pretty cinematic laugh. More like a confused snort because I genuinely didn't know how else to react. For the rest of the day, I kept waiting for the heaviness to come back, the cloud that usually followed me everywhere. But there was this small lift inside me, almost like a loose thread of hope pulling upward. I didn't talk about it with anyone. It felt too fragile to put into words, but internally something softened. I started noticing things I'd ignored before. How much better it felt to wake up after a real night's sleep, how my walks didn't drain me the way they used to, how I could stand a little straighter without feeling like an imposter in my own body. What surprised me most was how these small shifts changed the way I moved through the day. I wasn't suddenly confident or glowing or whatever people on social media claim to be after a life change. I was still me, tired, healing, figuring things out. But I caught myself humming while making breakfast, and that felt like a miracle in its own quiet way. It was the first time in months that my body didn't feel like something I had to fight against. Felt like something I could maybe, just maybe, rebuild a relationship with. And even though those changes were tiny, I knew they mattered. They were proof that the version of me I thought was gone, wasn't. She was still there trying to push through. And that realization did something to me. It made me want to keep going, even if I didn't know where it would lead. But looking back, that was only the beginning. When his name lit up on my phone, my first reaction was that old familiar punch in the stomach. The one that used to make me drop everything just to feel wanted again. For a moment, I almost slipped back into that version of me who would have apologized just to keep the peace, who would have convinced herself that any attention was better than none. But something felt different this time. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hoping he'd say the magic words to undo the hurt. I was strangely calm, like my body already knew what my mind was still catching up to. I opened the message expecting some kind of explanation, or maybe guilt wrapped in nostalgia. Instead, it was the usual, a vague "we should talk." Like all the damage was just a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared up over coffee. A few months earlier, that would have been enough to drag me right back in. I would have jumped at the chance to prove I was still worth choosing. But as I stared at those words, I realized something I never had before. I didn't owe him a doorway back into my life just because he asked for it. Typing no felt almost too simple for how big the moment was. But my hands didn't shake, and I didn't overthink it like I usually do. I just hit send. And as soon as I did, something inside me settled. It wasn't empowerment with fireworks and theme music. It was quieter than that. A grounding, like I had finally stopped abandoning myself. I didn't care whether he felt rejected. For once I cared how I felt. And the truth was, saying no felt like breathing after holding it for years. I remember waking up one morning and realizing my life didn't feel like something I was constantly trying to escape anymore. I wasn't suddenly glowing or transformed in some dramatic before and after way. None of that cinematic stuff people pretend happens overnight. My body hadn't changed enough for anyone else to notice. But I noticed. Not in the mirror, but in the way I moved through my day. There was a steadiness in me I hadn't felt in years. A kind of self-respect that didn't depend on whether someone else saw it or validated it. It was quiet, almost ordinary. But it felt like the beginning of a life I actually wanted to live. What surprised me most was how my relationship with myself shifted without me forcing it. I stopped talking to myself like an enemy. I stopped apologizing for needing rest, for saying no, for taking up space. I started paying attention to the small signals my body gave me. The tiredness I used to ignore, the stress I used to bury, the little sparks of joy I used to rush past. It wasn't about getting smaller or fixing anything. It was about finally understanding that my body wasn't the problem. The way I treated myself was. And once that clicked, everything else started to soften. I noticed the difference in moments no one else could see. Like when I walked into a room and didn't immediately scan for the closest corner to hide in. Or when I caught my reflection in a store window and didn't flinch. Or the first time I let myself laugh. A real laugh, without worrying how my face looked. These tiny moments added up, piece by piece, building something I didn't have before. A sense of worth that wasn't fragile anymore. I wasn't perfect. I still had days when old habits tugged at me, when I felt the urge to numb out or disappear. But I didn't crumble under them the way I used to. I didn't abandon myself. And that, more than anything, made me feel like someone I could finally rely on. Someone who deserved a life that didn't revolve around fear or shame. Someone who could stand in her own story without apologizing for existing. And even though I didn't see it then, this version of me, the one learning to choose herself over and over again, was about to face a moment that would test everything I'd built. Looking back, that was only the beginning. What surprised me most was what happened after. I didn't spiral. I didn't check my phone every minute. I didn't replay the decision in my head until it lost its meaning. I just went on with my day. carrying this small, steady confidence I hadn't felt since I was much younger. Choosing myself didn't feel selfish. It felt overdue. I realized how much of my life I had spent staying quiet, staying small, staying scared, and how good it felt to finally break that pattern, even in such a tiny way. I didn't know it then, but that one-word reply was about to open a completely different chapter of my life. And that's where things started to shift. Even now, after everything, what stays with me isn't the weight I lost, the steps I took, or the breakup that cracked me open. It's the quiet understanding that I don't need permission to take up space in my own life. For so long I lived like I owed the world an apology. For my body, for my emotions, for not being the easier, lighter version of myself I thought everyone wanted. But somewhere along this messy, imperfect path, I realized I don't have to earn my right to exist. I don't have to prove anything to be worthy of feeling at home in my own skin. That shift didn't happen in one moment. It happened in 100 small ones where I chose to show up for myself instead of abandoning who I was becoming. There are still days when the old fears knock on the door. The doubt, the comparison, the urge to shrink back into someone unnoticeable. But now I know how to meet those moments without running from them. I breathe, I pause, and I remind myself that I'm allowed to be here exactly as I am. I'm not fighting to become a different person anymore. I'm learning to stay with my body, with my truth, with the version of me that finally feels real. And that has changed my life more than any number ever could. If you've been walking through something heavy, or trying to find your way back to yourself, just know you're not the only one trying to figure it all out. Sharing this story took me a while, but I'm glad I did. And if it made you feel even a little less alone, that means a lot. If you want to hear more stories like this, you're welcome to stick around and subscribe. And looking back, even this part was only the beginning.